Hello, everyone. Well, I'm trying my first attempt, my victimology class, my first lesson plan online, so please be patient with me here because this is going to be a challenge for me, and I know it's going to be a challenge for you. But let's work through this together. Now, here's our first slide on child abuse, and if you look at that picture, what do you see? Well, I see a child obviously sad, maybe upset. But what about confused? The reason I have that first slide on there is because not only are children confused for what's happened to them, but they're also confused of why people can't come to their rescue. Or, in other words, the confusion works both ways. The child's confused, but so are people who try to understand child abuse. And that's what this whole section is going to be about. Understanding child abuse. So many people have a passion about fighting against child abuse, but so few people truly understand it. So hopefully with this section that we're going to have here, we'll at least give you the basics of what child abuse involves. And this is just a snapshot of my entire course on child abuse. For those who've had child abuse with me already, this will be familiar material, but there's just so much involved, but at least we're going to touch some of it today. So, CPTA, that stands for Child Abuse Prevention Treatment Act. This was an organization created in the 1960s to help train people and understand and respond to the issues of child abuse. It deals with children under the age of 18, and sometimes when cases of child abuse involve sexual abuse, it can go past 18, especially when we talk about reporting laws. So here are your four categories. You need to know these for testing purposes, but also I want to tell you about what is involved with each aspect. Now, first of all, emotional abuse, also known as psychological abuse. This is considered the most common form of abuse. And the reason it's considered the most common is because it interacts with all the other aspects of abuse. However, neglect is by far the most commonly reported. You're going to see a dramatic difference in the statistics from what is reported and what is considered the most common. We're going to go over each one. All right, here we go. This statistics change year to year. There's always off a percentage here and there, but it's always right around 70-80% of cases reported to social services are involving neglect. And look how small the number of psychological abuse is. Sexual abuse is always pretty consistently around 10% of all cases. But just keep this in mind for testing purposes again, that you need to know that neglect is the most commonly reported type of child abuse, but psychological/emotional abuse is considered the most common. So here's Virginia's law on child abuse. Now, let me just go over some of the key highlights. Inflict or threaten, create to inflict, or allow to be inflict upon a child physical, mental, or accidental means any kind of injury or create a substantial risk for the child's death or impairment. Child abuse also involves neglect, abandonment, sexual abuse, and exploitation. So what is this law saying? It's pretty much an overview of what constitutes child abuse, but it's kind of like a catch-all statement for everything. We're going to go over each category of child abuse, and we're going to see how some things are so subjective that some aspects of abuse you may not find meet the criteria of the child abuse law here, while others you think are clear examples of child abuse. So, if someone suspects child abuse, you report to social services. All reports of child abuse, no matter who the initial person reported to, ends up going to the Department of Health and Human Services and they keep all the data on child abuse. Now, if you notice in that line I have here, I have one word highlighted, and it's highlighted for a reason: suspect. How many cases of child abuse never ever get reported because people aren't sure that the abuse is occurring and they don't want to get someone in trouble? The burden is just so low, and there's no liability for a call if it's not done maliciously. All you need is suspicion. Let the experts who are trained in child abuse determine whether your suspicions are warranted or not. All you need as a reporter is just, if you suspect child abuse, then report it. Unfortunately, I can give you countless examples of how many people have been victims of child abuse. People talk about it in the neighborhoods, and they say after the fact, saying, I always suspected something happened here. Well, if people will just take the initiative and just report on that suspicion, then we'd probably have a lot less repeat victimizations of different children. Again, all you need to report child abuse is just suspicion of child abuse. So, one of the first questions: who commits child abuse? The male or the female? Now, if we were in the classroom, I'd obviously be picking on somebody, but I can't do this with the online version. So let me just say this here, that there's a big misperception when it comes to child abuse. And the reason I said that is because the answer to this question is a woman is more likely to abuse their child compared to a male. Now that surprises a lot of people because they think of women as being more of a nurturer compared to a male, and that's probably true. But the fact that women are around children a lot more than men, the statistics just show on that women are more likely to abuse their children or neglect their children because they're just around them so much more. Now, one major exception to this here, when you talk about the four categories I just discussed, is the issue of sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is predominantly a type of maltreatment committed by men. But everything else, when you combine everything together, women are more likely to abuse children compared to that of men. So, the other 50-50 question here. Girls or boys? When you talk about neglect, psychological, emotional abuse, physical abuse, the difference between gender is very slight. When it comes to sexual abuse, girls are more likely to be abused compared to boys. When you combine all four categories together, girls are more likely to be victims compared to that of boys. Now here's the latest statistics I got from the Department of Health and Human Services. Now remember what I said now. It's the Department of Health and Human Services is the major resource for collecting statistical data on child maltreatment. Now, they're always a couple of years lagging behind, so the latest information is what I'm providing to you. In 2017, you can see this here, based in the United States, that there were 327,000 plus cases of child abuse against boys and about 343,000 against girls. So it's like a 20,000 difference between. So they are close, but overall, when you combine them, girls are more likely to be victims than boys, especially when, like I said before, there's a big difference with sexual abuse that girls are the predominant victims of that type of maltreatment. Okay, so let's start talking about the different categories of abuse. Physical abuse. Each aspect of abuse we talk about is going to be extremely subjective. One of those being physical abuse. For example, some people have extreme points of view on striking a child. some caretakers believe that under no circumstance you ever spank a child, you hit a child in any way, saying violence just creates more violence. It's a learned behavior. Others believe that corporal punishment is a way of life. That if you're going to have a well-disciplined child and well-behaved child, it's important to initiate corporal punishment so they become better citizens. I'm not going to debate one way or the other what is right or wrong. All I'm going to talk about is the legalities of what's considered physical abuse, what is corporal punishment. Now, the irony of this topic is, think about this subject, think about this aspect. That if you, as a child, strike a parent or a caretaker, you could be charged with a criminal complaint via assault. However, if a caretaker or a parent strikes a child, under many circumstances, that use of force can be considered corporal punishment and therefore no consequences upon the caretaker. So how do we separate physical abuse from corporal punishment? Now, there's a lot of things that can separate the categories. For one thing, what's the reason for striking the child? If you're striking the child because they put their hands too close to the stove, or they didn't eat their vegetables, just that act itself can separate what's considered physical abuse versus corporal punishment. I think most people would agree that striking a child for not eating their vegetables might be considered abusive behavior. However, protecting a child from injuring themselves and by inflicting pain, people may not think of that as physical abuse. Also, the level of force you use. Where do you hit the child, for one thing? Are you slapping them on the buttocks? Are you slapping them in the face? Are you pinning them down? Are you pinching them? Are you using pain compliance? What is considered acceptable behavior? There's varying opinions on what is considered acceptable behavior, which separates physical abuse from corporal punishment. Some are very subjective, but others, like in this slide here, it's pretty obvious, right? The bruising in that child's eyes, there's nothing in the world a child can do to deserve that kind of punishment from a caretaker. So cases like this here are pretty clear, and they'd clearly be defined as physical abuse and probably face some type of sanction. However, other aspects of physical force are a lot more subjective, and you have that debate between what's considered corporal punishment and physical abuse. So who are the child abusers? Well, for one thing, parents and the caretakers are the most likely to physically abuse their child. Why? Because they're the ones around the children the most in the first place. And that's when you have to separate corporal punishment from discipline. And why do I say that? Because if someone is not a caretaker or a parent, they have no right under any circumstances to strike a child. If you are walking through a store and you see a child acting up, and you don't know this child, you can't walk up to that child and slap that child and say, I'm just issuing corporal punishment. In order for it to be corporal punishment, you have to be a caretaker or a parent. So the subjectivity of how much force to use is a way of life for some, and others, again, like I said, people won't use it at all. And what about people who use drugs? Do you think that affects their rationale on whether to use corporal punishment? Do you think they may have more issues that may cause them to use more physical force? So individual theories, or not theories, but individual perspectives like drug addiction can be a factor on physical abuse. Next category, emotional abuse or psychological abuse. It's like potato. They both pretty much are saying the same thing. Some people use one or the other. It doesn't matter. Again, psychological abuse is considered the most common because it interacts with all other aspects. For example, we just got through talking about physical abuse. When a caretaker strikes a child and they use a lot of force, that force might be considered physical abuse. But what is said during that strike, something to the effect of, "I wish you were never born," or "I hate you," and then you strike them, that would be considered psychological abuse. But unfortunately, when things get reported to social services, usually that physical act is the only thing that gets reported, and that those comments of "I wish you were never born" or "I hate you" never get reported, and that's why the statistics are so low on psychological abuse. Emotional abuse, pretty standard definition here. Causes or could cause serious behavioral, cognitive, emotional, or mental disorders. Studies have shown over and over that psychological abuse and emotional abuse cause a lot of long-term consequences. Think about this as a child. You get a beating, for lack of a better term. That might hurt at the time, but if you tell your child you wish you never had them or you wish they were never born, those can stay there for a lifetime. Other aspects of abuse, I'm going to look at the different categories. These are just some examples of what can constitute what's considered psychological or emotional abuse. Corrupting, if you see on the right hand side, corrupting, that's probably the most common form of emotional abuse, where it's tied to criminal behavior, where parents or caretakers convince children to commit crimes. Isolating is sometimes associated with criminal behavior too. For sometimes parents won't let their kids go out or socialize with anyone because the parents are involved with criminal activity, and they don't want the kids to say anything. So what are they doing? They're isolating their child from any social contact. The other categories: rejecting, inconsistent treatment, cruelty, belittling. It just amazes me to no end that some people will make fun of their own kids. People can be pretty cruel. And you think of how that old saying, "Sticks and stones can break my bones, but names will never hurt me." But names do hurt, and especially when those words come from someone that's supposed to love you. So here's some of the warning signs of emotional abuse: fearful, withdrawn, anxious, worried about repercussions, doing something wrong, extremely compliant or demanding because you're not getting enough attention, doesn't seem to be attached to the parent or the caretaker. Think about when you see parents with kids outside. How many kids are interacting with their kids, with their parents rather, or their caretakers, and other kids you see them and you're not sure if those kids belong to that parent or not because there's no interaction. These are some signs are obvious, some signs are rather subtle. The subjectivity of psychological emotional abuse is so difficult that I personally have never brought a psychological case to court. I couldn't imagine the difficulty of prosecuting a case. For example, how do you prosecute this child's not getting enough love, or they're being ridiculed? How do you show that that's causing damage? In contrast, if you bring someone to court for like a broken leg, what's your evidence? Your evidence is the broken leg, right, from the physical abuse. But how do you show depression is the result of emotional or psychological abuse? How do you know that child didn't suffer from depression in the first place? Is emotional or psychological abuse a significant problem in our society? It sure is. Prosecuting is even more difficult to bring forward. Neglect. As I said before, neglect is considered the most common form of child abuse that is reported. Not that happens, but is reported. Now, I'm going to go over different categories of neglect, but let me just give you a simple definition. Look at that first bullet there. Is the failure to provide basic needs of a child. What is the basic needs? Is that pretty subjective? Don't you think there's various opinions of what is considered the basic needs of a child? Some things are obvious. Some things are pretty subtle. Everyone has different opinions on what a child needs. And that's what we're going to talk about with the subjectivity of neglect. Neglect differs from the other categories because it's not what you do, it's what you fail to do. There's different categories of neglect, and it also, neglect depends on the child's age. For example, if you're not going to be charged with supervisory neglect for leaving a 16-year-old alone for a couple hours, but if you left an infant alone for a couple hours, is that neglectful? It seems to me it is. So depending on the developmental age of the child. Now, I use the example of age, like of 2 months old or something like that. But it doesn't always fall just with the age itself. For example, if you have two 8-year-olds, one 8-year-old can be extremely articulate, sophisticated, worldly for lack of a better term, and another child the same age can be extremely neglectful and have to be a lot more dependent on their caretakers. So the actions or the inactions of the caretaker can depend significantly on the developmental level of that child. So here are your 4 categories of neglect: physical, educational, emotional, and supervisory. I'm going to go over each category. No matter what category we go over, unless it's extreme, like a baby being left in a car and ends up dying as a real extreme, it usually doesn't get as much attention because it seems to get more attention for what people do instead of what people fail to do. And not everyone has the same opinion of what constitutes neglect. Physical neglect, sometimes also referred to as medical neglect, can involve the health care of the child. There's numerous examples I can give, but let's just say failing to take the child to the doctor, failure to get the child shots, failure for the child to failure for the child to get cold medicine, failure, just the basic needs of a child in medical care. Physical neglect, in contrast, can be just the basic responsibility of a caretaker. Feeding your child, clothing your child, cleaning up after your child. How often does a child get a bath? How often do you change a diaper? Now, the picture you see here, this is a pretty extreme example of a rash, but isn't the best caretakers even have rashes on their children? What is the appropriate amount of times to change a child's diaper? There's a lot of subjectivity when it comes to physical neglect. The appropriate clothing. How many people have different opinions on how heavy of a jacket to wear, or to wear a jacket at all? At what age should a child be have the ability to choose what kind of clothing they want. All these questions are very subjective, and we get a lot of reports on neglect because of that very issue. Because some people think that aspects of neglect, which involve physical aspects, are neglectful actions, but people receiving the complaint may say this is no big deal. Very subjective. Educational neglect. I'm going to talk about chins in a second here, but let's just look at some of the basics of educational neglect. Failing to register a child. Failing to enforce truancy. Failure to help a kid with their homework. But as far as age goes, and make sure you know this, that when it comes to age, when a child turns 16, the parents are no longer responsible for their education, and the child is not required to go to school. But let's just say the child is under 16, and we have to separate what's considered educational neglect versus CHINS. CHINS, the acronym of CHINS, stands for Child in Need of Services. Now, some parents, I already gave examples of basic neglect, but some parents have incorrigible children. They refuse to go to school. The parents try everything they can to get them to school. They can't get the child to school. They ask for help, and the child's still incorrigible, so the court intervenes and puts the responsibility on the child, and puts a child protection, not child protection order, but puts a CHINS petition on them, making them a so-called status offender, and they face the consequences instead of the parent. So you have different aspects of educational neglect. One with the parent's responsibility and one without parent's responsibility, when again, if they make every reasonable effort to get the child to school and the child still resists, then the burden is placed on the child. This is kind of out of sequence here, but emotional abuse, rather. This is just another prime example. How do you prosecute a case for not getting enough love? Very subjective. Like I said, I've never done one before. Here's a scenario which I have from a regular classroom. I'm not going to be able to do this on an online scenario, but if you looked at the scenario, I bet everyone would have a difference of opinion on what is the proper age to leave a child alone under this scenario. This would fall under what's called supervisory neglect. Everyone has a different opinion on what age to leave a child alone and how long that child should be left alone. Some of the physical indicators involving supervisory neglect involve clothing, inappropriate weather, hygiene, not caring, constant fatigue. If you notice, these same physical indicators can be applied to what? Physical neglect as well. But when you're not watching your child through supervisory neglect, what are you doing? You're physically neglecting them as well. So these can apply to both physical and supervisory neglect. And when I say constant fatigue, why does this apply to supervisory neglect? It might be a little bit different from physical neglect on number 4 here. If parents aren't watching their children tend to stay up as late as they want. And then they have to get up for school, and they go to school with can barely keep their head up because they're so tired because they get to stay up as late as they want. That's just one example of how supervisory neglect can lead to constant fatigue. Besides physical signs, you have your behavioral signs. Children not going to school. Their self-worth. Can't keep up with other children. Stealing or hoarding food. These are just some examples. But kids who are neglected, sometimes the examples will be dramatic, while other examples you're going to have might be rather subtle. Some of the causes of neglect: intergenerational. That's how I was raised. Extreme views, radical views. How many kids in the family? Does the youngest get more attention than the oldest? Does the middle child get ignored? Are there extra factors like the environment, parental stress, unemployment, both parents working? I have seen so many parents making all kinds of money, but they don't watch their kids. And so, as a matter of fact, I've seen some of the worst drug addicts for children are the direct results of two parents focusing so much on making the almighty dollar, for a lack of a better term, instead of watching out for the kids. And one of the repercussions of neglect is drug addiction. Sometimes neglectful parents can be from intra-individual theories, or not individual theories, but intra-individual perspectives. They just don't care. It's their personality. Some people just don't have that nurturing instinct. Some people might have mental health issues, whether it could be depression, or some people might have extreme mental health issues like being psychotic, which can cause significant amount of harm on the child. You can click this link if you want. It just shows how there's a trend going around the country of how many babies are becoming addicted. They're born addicted because of their mother's substance abuse. The final category which you're going to talk about is the most talked about anyways is sexual abuse. It seems to get a lot more attention because it disturbs a lot of people, justifiably so. But look at some of the basic definitions of what sexual abuse entails. Sexual activities involve the child can't comprehend, is not developmentally unprepared, and cannot give consent or violates laws or social taboos. Cannot comprehend. How many kids get involved with sex and they don't understand the repercussions of what's involved, whether STDs, pregnancies, things like that. They don't know the repercussions, and therefore that's why it's supposed to be for older individuals. They're unprepared to take on the emotions that are associated with sexual encounters. Can't give consent, the legality of it. Even if the child understands what the law says, like for statutory rape, the child cannot consent to having sex whether they want to or not. But that last section of the definition is what gets the most attention. That violates the laws or social taboos of society. And when I say the social taboos of society, I'm referring to how many people just find it absolutely disgusting to have sex with a small child. You just don't do that. You don't try to harm a child that way. Sexual abuse is classified into two main categories. It can be extrafamilial and familial. Extrafamilial, just like the category: stranger, person of authority, coaches, babysitters, things like that, family friend. The people who abuse children, it's almost a 50-50 split. Half of the abuse occurs from people within the family, half within extrafamilial. But I'll tell you right now, make sure you know this for testing purposes, that strangers is the least likely category. Which I'm going to have a slide in a second, which is going to talk about how rare it is. But family, friends, family, persons of authority, things like this, these are all different categories of how people get access to the children. In contrast, familial abuse is people within the family, just like I'm giving the examples here. Now, is familial abuse a significant problem in our society? It certainly is. How many people want to go home to the safety of their household only to find out that's where the abuse occurs? Now, out of all these categories listed here, the grandmother and the sister are the only two familial categories that I didn't arrest people for. Because I've arrested moms, dads, grandfathers, and brothers. And is it common? Yes. Is it challenging? Yes, because how easy is it, how difficult is it rather for a child even to talk about what happened to them within a family? So let's talk about the different types of sexual abuse. It can occur both with contact and non-contact. Sexually touching a child. Now, when we talked about sexually touching a child, if I touch a child on the shoulder, I'm not sexually touching them, but anyone who touches a child or on their genitalia or their body for sexual gratification or the breast of a child for sexual gratification, that would be considered sexual abuse. The contact can be on the adult as well, to forcibly sexually touch the adult. Stripping, spanking a child. Some people actually get sexually aroused by stripping and spanking their child. They say it's for discipline, but they're actually doing it for sexual arousal. Oral, vaginal, and anal intercourse. Now, let me just say this about oral intercourse. The technical name would be fellatio. The vast majority of contact sexual abuse cases I had as an investigator involved the male putting his penis in the mouth of a child. That was the most common contact type of sexual abuse I experienced as well as an investigator. Now, forcing the child to engage in prostitution, obviously there's sexual contact there as well. Non-contact. Now, what's concerning about non-contact is a lot of people fail to report child abuse or sexual abuse because there's no contact involved. And that's the whole purpose of this discussion here, is because sexual abuse can involve non-contact as well, and you should be reporting non-contact sexual abuse just like you would report to sexual contact. Taking pornographic pictures of a child. Showing pornography to a child. Actually, I've seen that as a part of a grooming process, which I'll talk about in a second, about showing the pornography to get the child aroused. Talking to a child in a sexual manner, or using your smartphone, sexting. Exposing yourself. Masturbating in front of the child. Peeping on children while they're dressing or showering. I've even had cases where people have put holes in the bathroom walls to watch the children urinate. So there's a lot of sexual abuse that occurs with non-contact as well as contact. Who are the victims? We know that girls are more likely to be victimized than boys, significantly, with sexual abuse. It can happen at any age. The youngest I've ever experienced was an infant who the guy would put his fingers in the child's anus for sexual gratification, right up until sexual intercourse with 17-year-olds. It happens with all different ages, all different cultures, ethnic backgrounds. Why is this so significant? Because when we talk about the other three categories with neglect or physical abuse, you might see a significant difference on the data depending on the culture. In contrast, with sexual abuse, there's insignificant difference in any of the cultures. It doesn't matter whether you're black, white, Asian, Latino, Arab, Native American, it doesn't matter. The rate of sexual abuse is pretty consistent with all ethnic and cultural groups. It doesn't matter whether you're poor or rich, happens in all families anywhere in the world, whether it's rural or urban. But that last bullet will have more vulnerability and more chance for victimization based on your intellectual or physical capacities. Children with mental disabilities are easier targets. They don't understand what's happening to them, and if it does happen to them, they have a hard time voicing or explaining to the abuse to a responsible adult. Physical capacities, the same type of limitations, were about defending themselves and making you more likely to be a victim if you can't fight off your attacker or resist. But these are all different aspects of who are the more likely victims. But overall, when it comes to sexual abuse, girls are the predominant victims of that type of maltreatment. So who commits? Well, it's interfamilial or extrafamilial, familial or extrafamilial. It's pretty even. But when it comes to strangers, it only accounts for 10%. Why is this so significant? Because we have all this training, parents warn their kids about stranger danger, and there's nothing wrong with that because it's a pretty serious thing if a stranger gets a hold of your child, that mysterious man in the trench coat, right? But the chances of that happening are pretty slim, and it's pretty disheartening to think that it's more likely the child's going to be abused from someone in your family than a stranger. But the facts are still the same. The tactics are also different. I think it's the next slide here, so be patient with me. I'm sorry. Let me just go back here then. We talk about how it occurs as well. For example, most sexual abuse it happens through manipulation. You hear the so-called grooming process, where they try to befriend the child and give them all special attention. This can happen both in familial and extrafamilial abuse. It can't happen with strangers, though, because they're getting one chance at it. And because of that one chance, if they don't have the opportunity to groom a child, they're more likely to use physical force on that child in order for them to engage in sexual activity. So keep that in mind as well, that people that the child knows, whether it's family members or not, the sexual abuse is more likely to occur through manipulation, but if it's with a stranger, this is more likely to occur through physical force. And when it comes to males versus females, males are the predominant offenders on just about all sexual assault cases. And I just got through saying this here about most sexual abuse occurs through manipulation, but not a stranger may sexually abuse a child through force. But they can use manipulation as well. So to make sure I'm not confusing anyone here, that the chance it's very unlikely for anyone to use force on a child. But if someone is going to use force on a child, it's going to be a stranger, because people who know the child, it's easier to manipulate them through the grooming process. A stranger can try to manipulate the child, but it's also a lot easier for them just to use force on the child to get what they want. Okay, I'm going to play a video for you here. Hopefully it works. Like I said, I'm trying for the first time, and like I said, I'm asking you to be patient with me. Everyone knows technology is not my niche, and I'm really working hard to do this for you guys. So I hope things work out for you. And let me play this video, and hopefully you'll be able to watch this here.
I think the ACLU is suffering from normophobia, and that means opposing anything that's good and decent and normal and trying to promote what is abnormal.
Consider for a few moments the ACLU's efforts to protect a declared pedophile organization. Please note that the following contains some graphic scenes. Parental discretion is advised. 10-year-old Jeffrey Curley of Cambridge, Massachusetts was a bright little boy who enjoyed ice skating, baseball, and a good laugh. Barbara Curley is Jeffrey's mom.
Jeffrey was very lovable. Everybody loved Jeff. He was a joker, always joking around with people. His favorite thing in the whole world to do was ice skate.
But on October 1st, 1997, Jeff went for a ride with a neighbor, Salvatore Sicari and his friend Charles James, seen here. The two men promised to buy him a new bike to replace his bike, which had been stolen a few weeks before. He never returned.
Well, what these guys did, they stole his bicycle, and they promised Jeffrey a bicycle, and they played that out for a few weeks with him.
Bob Curley is Jeffrey's father. He points out where Jeffrey was last seen alive.
Jeff was right here in the yard watching the dog, and James Sicari said, "I'm buying the car," and he said, "Come on, Jeff, we're going to go get your bicycle." And he jumped in the key, ran in the house, said to his grandma, he said, "Man, I'll be back in 10 minutes, I'm going to go get something." And that was it. He jumped in the car with him, and they survived.
After abducting him, it became clear what they were really after: his body for sexual purposes.
And they offered him $50 to have sex with him, and he refused. And he fought them, and they killed him.
It was probably one of the most brutal deaths that anybody could ever encounter.
McCurley's attorney, Larry Pizzoli, tells that Charles James, the main perpetrator in this case, did.
When he got in the back seat of the car, when Salvatore Sicari was driving it, he attempted to attack Jeffrey Curley.
They stuffed a wet gasoline rag in Jeffrey's mouth.
When Jeffrey resisted, he sat on him, James being well over 200 pounds, and put the gasoline-soaked rag on Jeffrey's mouth. The fumes burnt the interior of his lungs, and that's how he died.
And Jeffrey fought them for over 15 to 20 minutes, slowly suffocated. They took him to James's apartment, and he had sex with my son's dead body.
They then put the corpse in a Rubbermaid green plastic container, put lime on it, taped it up, taped the container up, and then drove to a place in Maine where they pulled it off the river.
NAMBLA is the North American Man-Boy Love Association.
NAMBLA advocates that it is their right, if they can convince a 6-year-old or 7-year-old child to do a sexual act with them, when the children is nothing about sex in exchange for candy bar, then that is consensual sex and it's okay. And that's what they advocate and preach to their membership. They don't want their kids, they want your kids. And the age of preference for NAMBLA is 6 to 12.
The more details the Curleys learned about NAMBLA, the more they realized they had to do something to prevent this type of tragedy from happening to other little boys in the future.
NAMBLA's a group of perverts that tries to legitimize raping and sodomizing little boys, and they try to hide behind the First Amendment.
Good evening. Freedom of speech, expression, constitutional guarantees that have long protected the views and ideas of even the most controversial groups. But many are now asking, where do you draw the line? Where does free speech end and responsibility begin?
Robert and Barbara Curley are fighting to answer that question. The Massachusetts couple is suing the North American Man-Boy Love Association, an organization that openly defends what it calls intergenerational sex. Critics call them pedophiles. The Curleys say that NAMBLA shares responsibility for their son's murder. Their lawsuit seeks millions of dollars in damages, the hope being that a massive verdict would effectively drive NAMBLA out of business. The Curleys and their supporters say that this tactic is a legitimate way of holding groups morally and financially accountable. Opponents call it an end run around the Constitution. Here's Kathy Slobogan.
Jeffrey Curley was just 10 years old when he was killed. Not by strangers, but by men he thought were his friends. 2 men who wanted sex from him for the promise of a new bike.
He thought they were his friends, and they were targeting him for sex. That was the reason for the whole seduction. That was the reason for the lure of the bicycle. And I think the evidence points to the fact that when Jeffrey Curley found out what these men were after, he said no, and he struggled, and that's why they killed him.
And who is defending NAMBLA? The ACLU.
This would obviously be titillating to a pedophile. A pedophile might feel encouraged by them, but it is not the same thing as saying to somebody, go out and attack that boy. There is room in this country for people who believe that man-boy love is okay. There is room for people who believe it, who say it, but not who do it. We shouldn't confuse stuff that we read that gets us scared, enraged, that makes us disgusted. We shouldn't confuse that with illegal speech.
The Thomas Memorial Center was an answer to me and my family's prayers that helped us financially, spiritually, and wholeheartedly.
Upon hearing about Jeff's death, one kind-hearted stranger made this collage dedicated to the memory of Jeffrey Curley.
I came to my home every day, and I looked at it, and I remember a wonderful baby. It was so loving. He trusted everybody. That trust got me killed. And I have to take these people out. Because I don't want any other family to go through what we would do. Because I hear really sending my with laughter. I remember calling me just to hold him again. It'd be so beautiful. He's gone. And we really need to take this organization down. All of us. And we need people's help to do it.
Okay, we're back. NAMBLA is a pretty disturbing organization, but let me just say this here, that it's pretty much decimated at this point here because so many law enforcement officers have worked undercover online to lure these people out and bring them to justice. Doesn't mean that the organization doesn't exist or that other organizations are just as active and have a different name, but the scary thing about this here is there's actually networks out there that communicate with all the technology that's available to seduce and sexually abuse children. So, what is a pedophile? I use the same picture in my criminology class here because I think it's important to use the picture of Superman. Why do I have that picture? For those who know me as a rape investigator, I've arrested all the pillars of society. Whether it's police officers, teachers, business executives, baseball coaches, all well-respected people of society, the so-called supermen of society. I've taken a lot of ridicule for arresting these people. I get criticized for my actions because these people are not only in high prestigious positions, but a lot of them are very prestigious and very charismatic, and no one ever wants to believe that they would be the ones who could abuse a child. Here's one of the definitions of what's considered a pedophile. This is the key. A lot of people think a pedophile is someone who sexually abuses children. Well, there's a lot more to it than that, because actually, for one thing, if you look at the definition, pedophile or being a pedophile is not a crime because it's only a thought process, the mens rea. There's no crime about fantasizing about young prepubescent children. It's only when you act on those desires you convert from a pedophile to a child molester. So the simple definition of a pedophile is someone who's sexually attracted to prepubescent children. A pedophile can be a man or woman, heterosexual, gay, it doesn't matter. Anyone can be a pedophile. So you can name which one's the pedophile here. Now, if we were in class right now, I'd ask you to figure out if you could pick which one it is. But since we're not, I'm not going to be able to tell you, so we're going to move on. But as you can see, anyone can be a pedophile whether it's a parent, business executive, grandparent, an older teenager, or a person representing God. Anyone can be a pedophile. Pedophile is classified as preferential or situational. And all that means is preferential is they have an attraction to a particular type of child. In other words, someone might have a sexual attraction to little blonde-haired girls under the age of 8, or little black boys as they're just getting out of diapers, things like that. They even prefer to have sex with children compared to that of adults. Situational sex offenders, in contrast, they may prefer adult sexual relationships, but if the opportunity arises, they will take advantage of it and have sex with a child, but it's not their preference. As I said before, pedophilia is a state of mind. Not all pedophiles are child molesters. Some will never act on their desires. And anyone can be a pedophile, no matter what your gender, age, background, it doesn't matter. Most of the molestation occurs through manipulation, but when it does occur, when it is extreme, usually with strangers, it can result in death. And those are the ones that get all the attention. When a child's abducted and raped and murdered. Here's just an example of how someone can get killed, kill a child while having sex. The penetration didn't kill the child, but what happened was his whole body lying on top of a 6-month-old suffocated the child, and this kid ended up dying. It's a pretty tragic story. You think about the terms rape and child molester. Whenever we talk about the crime of rape, crime and rape is always considered like a crime of violence. And in many cases, child molestation is a crime of violence. But again, most crimes of sexual assault involving children don't involve force. It's through manipulation. In rape, sometimes, unlike with child molestation, is to prove someone's masculinity, the sexual capability of controlling another person. Child abuse laws. Okay. Let's think about the different laws we have designed here to protect children. Amber Hageman. Has anyone ever heard of Amber Alert? Well, children being abducted, we have the Amber Alert system now to notify the potential suspect, whether it be in a vehicle or where they're seen leaving. It all originated from the case from Amber Hageman out of Texas, where this girl was abducted off her bicycle and was found dead 4 days later. This was the first case that initiated the Amber Alert system, but it got a lot more powerful as years went on and became nationwide. The Jacob Weddling Act. The Jacob Weddling Act discusses sex offender registration. It was the first law created to put sex offenders on the registry. However, this law was unique. The guy to the right is the guy who killed that little boy, and it wasn't discovered until almost 20 years later, where they told him where his remains were to confirm that he was dead. But this boy got raped and murdered by this guy here, and they committed. They initiated a sex offender registry system. But on the Jacob Weddling Act, the registry was only pertaining to law enforcement. The general public could not see who was on the registry, who was not. It was just an investigatory tool for law enforcement. Megan's Law. This was created in 1994. Just as it says after Megan Kanker, who was raped and murdered by a neighbor. As you can see, he lured the child into his house to look at puppies, and once inside, he raped and murdered this girl. It created outrage in the community for two reasons. The first reason being that the child was raped and murdered. But the second reason was, how could someone so dangerous be living amongst them? Because they discovered that this person had 2 prior sexual assault convictions, and he was living right within the neighborhood, and no one knew anything about it. So Megan's Law was initiated in New Jersey, where there was public notification of where any sex offender lived. The federal government, in response to Megan's Law, enhanced the Jacob-Wetterling Act by making the Jacob-Wetterling Act for public notification. They called that Megan's Law, the revision to Jacob-Wetterling Act. So Megan's Law, unlike Jacob-Wetterling Act, is for public notification. But there's ways to avoid the sex offender registry. You can have a misdemeanor sexual assault, have that charge against you, and out of plea bargain say, I'm just going to plead guilty to a regular assault. If you plead bargain to a non-sexual offense, now you're no longer on the registry. Virginia, like all 50 states, has mandatory reporting laws. You see some of the ones listed here. In addition to what's listed here is university employees and coaches. I call this the Jerry Sandusky Amendment, because after that case with Penn State occurred, that they included university professionals. But again, like I said at the very beginning of this lecture, all you need is suspicion. Some states list certain professions, while other states other states will just say any other person. In other words, everyone has to report. But all 50 states have mandatory reporting laws. And I can't stress enough, all you have to do is suspect abuse. You don't have to know for sure. Some of the consequences: the physical health. Some people can't have children later on. Sexually transmitted diseases, psychological trauma. The behavioral consequences can be anything from acting out of anger, sexually assaulting other children. Psychological consequences can range from anything from depression to suicide. Studies have shown that boys who are more likely to be sexually abused are more likely to commit suicide compared to girls. So, how do we prevent? How do we have primary prevention? Public notices, support groups, public awareness announcements. These are just general preventative measures to prevent child abuse. Other levels can include secondary prevention, where certain families might be at more risk, so we'll have parental support groups, special parental education programs, maybe even have family visiting programs, family resource centers designed to help particular families who are at risk. And the last category here is for families who are really at risk: intensive preservation services, parental mentoring programs, mental health services for children, in-house care. But this last stage is for people who are at severe risk of victimization. That concludes my first online class ever, and it starts with my victimology class on child abuse. I wanted to pick a topic that I was most comfortable with for my first venture onto online training. I hope you enjoyed our first lecture, and I hope it came out. See you later.